Hi, everyone. This is Andrea Mackenzie reading to you from Toronto, Ontario, Canada. And today I'll be reading Chapter 15 of Ella Montgomery's Magic for Marigold, One Clear Call. I hope you enjoy it. I am afraid that if Marigold could have defined her state of mind when her mother told her she must go to the missionary meeting in the church that evening, she would have said she was bored with the prospect. For a little girl who had three-fourth cousins in the foreign mission field, it must be confessed that Marigold was shamefully indifferent to missionary work in general. She had planned to spend the evening with Sylvia, and she didn't want to exchange Sylvia's alluring company for a dull, stupid, poky old missionary meeting. The adjectives are Marigold's, not mine, and if you blame her for them, please remember that few lasses of 11 outside memoirs have any very clear ideas of the heathen in their blindness. For Marigold, foreign missions were something that grown-ups and ministers naturally took to, but which were far removed from her sphere of thought and action. So she didn't see why she should be dragged out to hear a foreign missionary speak. She had heard one the night she went with Gwenny, a queer, sunburned, spectacled man, tremendously in earnest, but dreadfully dull. And Marigold considered she had had enough of it. But grandmother could not go out after night because of her rheumatism, and Salome had a sore foot. And mother, for some strange reason, was set on going. It seemed that the speaker of the evening was a lady and an old schoolmate of hers. She wanted Marigold for company. Marigold would have done anything and gone anywhere for mother, even to a missionary meeting. So she trotted resignedly along the pleasant starlit road with mother and thought mainly about the new dress of apricot georgette that mother, in spite of grandmother's pursed lips, had promised her for Willa Rogers's birthday party. Marigold got her first shock when the missionary rose to speak. Could that wonderful creature be a missionary? Marigold had never seen anyone so entrancingly beautiful in her life. What strange, deep, dark, appealing eyes! What cheek of creamy pallor despite India's suns! What a crown of burnished red gold hair! What exquisite outreaching hands that seemed to draw you magnetically whither they would! What a haunting voice, full of pathos and unnameable charm! And what a lovely, lovely white dress with a pale, seraphic blue girdle hanging to the hem of it. Dr. Violet Merriweather had not been speaking for 10 minutes before Marigold was longing through all her soul to be a foreign missionary, with the uttermost ends of the earth for her inheritance. The only thing that surprised her was that there was no visible halo around Dr. Violet's head. Oh, what a thrilling address! Marigold had a moment of amazed wonder at herself for ever supposing foreign missions were pokey before she was swept out on that flood tide of eloquence to a realm she had never known existed, a realm in which self-sacrifice and child widows and India's coral strand were all blended together into something indescribably fascinating and appealing. Nay, more than appealing, demanding. Before Dr. Violet was halfway through her address, Marigold Leslie, entranced in the old Leslie pew, was dedicating her life to foreign missions. It was a sudden conversion, but a very thorough one. Already, Marigold felt that she was cut off forever from her old life, her old companions, her old dreams. She was not the silly, wicked little girl who had come unwillingly to the missionary meeting an hour ago, thinking of apricot dresses and fairy playmates on the hill. Not she. Consecrated, set apart, all the rest of her life to follow that shining upward path of service Dr. Violet Merriweather pointed out. Someday she, too, might be Dr. Marigold Leslie. Think of it. She had sometimes wondered whom she would like to resemble when she grew up. Mother? But mother was put upon. Everybody bossed her. But she had no longer any doubt. She wanted to be exactly like Dr. Violet Merriweather. She hated M. Church for giggling behind her. She looked with scornful contempt at Elder McLeod's 4 grown-up daughters. Why weren't they in the foreign mission field? She almost died of shame when she sneezed rapidly 3 times in succession, just when Dr. Violet was making her most impassioned appeal to the young girls. Was there not one in this church tonight who would answer, "Here am I," to the one clear call? And Marigold, who longed to spring to her feet and say it, could only sneeze until the great moment was past and Dr. Merriweather had sat down. Mr. Thompson followed with a few words. He lacked entirely the fascination of Dr. Merriweather, but one of his sentences struck burningly across Marigold's thrilled soul. A foreign missionary, he said, must be calm, serene, patient, tactful, self-reliant, resourceful, and deeply religious. Marigold remembered every one of his adjectives. It was something of a large order, but Marigold, in her uplift, had no doubt she could fill it eventually, and she would begin at once to prepare herself for her life work. At once. She went down the aisle as if she trod on air. Oh, how wicked and foolish she had been before this wonderful night. But now her face was, what had been Dr. Merriweather's phrase? Set towards the heights, distant, shining heights of service and sacrifice. Marigold shivered in ecstasy. Tommy Blair was going down the opposite aisle. Marigold had hated Tommy Blair bitterly ever since the day he had written across the front page of her reader in his sprawling, inky hand, "This book is one thing, my fist is another. If you steal the one, you'll feel the other." But she must forgive him. A missionary must forgive everybody. She smiled at him so radiantly across the church that Tommy Blair went out and told his cronies that Marigold Leslie was gone on him. Part 2. Marigold could not tell her mother of her great resolve. It would make poor mother feel so badly. If father had been alive, it would be different. But she was all mother had. That was where part of the self-sacrifice lay. As for telling grandmother, Marigold never dreamed of it. But she plunged at once with all her might into the preparation for her life work. Grandmother and mother knew there was something in the wind, though they couldn't imagine what. I do not know if they considered Marigold calm, serene, patient, tactful, etc., but I do know they thought her very funny. "Whatever it is, I suppose it will run its course," said grandmother resignedly, out of her experience. But mother was secretly a little bit worried. Something must be the matter when Marigold said she would rather not have a new apricot dress. Her old one was quite good enough. And she didn't even want to go to Willa's party, only grandmother insisted because the Rogerses would be offended. Marigold went under protest and condescended to the other little girls, pitying them for the dull, commonplace lives before them. Pitying Algy Rogers, too. Everyone knew his mother had vowed he should be a minister when he wanted furiously to be a carpenter. How different from her high, self-elected lot. "My, but ain't Marigold Leslie getting stuck up," Willa Rogers said. Marigold laid aside the tiny diamond ring Aunt Marigold had given her on her last birthday. Consecrated people should not, she felt, wear diamond rings. Uncle Claude offered to get her one of the new striped silk parasols she had craved, but Marigold thanked him firmly and serenely, and would he please give her a concordance instead. Uncle Claude chuckled and gave it to her. He did not know what particular magic Marigold was making now, but he knew she was getting a tremendous lot of satisfaction out of it. She was. It was positive rapture to perfuse the new ribbon hat streamers for which her soul had once longed, and wear her old hat to Cousin Nellie's wedding. Once Marigold had been interested in weddings. Who knew when one grew up? But that was past. She must never ever think of being married. Marigold was nothing if not thorough. Not the counsels of perfection for her. She washed dishes and beat eggs and weeded her garden, wrapped as a saint. She gave up reading everything except missionary literature. She pored over the missionary books in the Sunday school library, especially one fascinating little fat brown volume, the biography of a missionary who had prepared herself from the age of 6. Marigold felt she had lost many precious years, but she would do her best to catch up. She rose at 5 o'clock once to read the Bible and pray. That would sound well in a memoir. The said missionary had arisen at 5 o'clock every morning of her life from her 6th birthday, but said missionary did not have a grandmother. That made all the difference. The only thing that really hurt very badly was giving up Sylvia. At first, Marigold felt she could not do this, but she must. Sacrifice was not really sacrifice unless it hurt you. Dr. Violet had said so. She explained it all tearfully to Sylvia. Was it only fancy, or did a mocking elfin rill of laughter follow her down the orchard from the cloud of spruce? It almost seemed as if Sylvia didn't think she meant it. Marigold tried to fill up the resulting gap in her life by imagining herself being carried about on the backs of elephants and rescuing child widows from burning at the risk of her life. To be sure, Dr. Violet had not said anything about riding on elephants. She had even mentioned a prosaic motor car. And Mr. Thompson said widows were no longer burned. But no doubt something just as dreadful was done to them. Marigold stifled her longing for Sylvia in rescuing them by the dozen. Oh, I fancy Uncle Quan was right. Marigold had some moments of agonized wonder if she would ever be able to pray in public. She tried to make a small beginning by saying "Amen" under her breath whenever Mr. Thompson said anything in his prayers that appealed to her. And it was very hard to decide where she would go as a missionary. She shuddered for days between Japanese earthquakes and Indian snakes, until she got a book about the lepers in India. The lepers carried the day. They must be attended to, snakes or no snakes. She would be a missionary to the lepers. And meanwhile, grandmother was horribly cross because Marigold had forgotten to water the geraniums. She couldn't explain to grandmother that she had forgotten because she was bringing an Indian village through a famine. But she was calm and serene under grandmother's disapproval. Very. Part 3. For 2 or 3 weeks, this was all very well and satisfying. Then Marigold yearned for what Alexander the Great would have called more worlds to conquer, and Dr. Violet Merriweather might have termed a wider field of service. The heroine of the memoirs was always visiting someone who was sick or in trouble and working wonders of consolation. Marigold felt she should do the same. But whom to visit? There was nobody sick or in trouble that Marigold knew of near Cloud of Spruce just then. Unless it might be Mrs. Delegard. The thought of her came to Marigold like an inspiration. Mrs. Delegard of the black robes and the sad, sad face, who never went anywhere but wandered about in her big garden all day long in South Harmony. Marigold had heard someone say that Mrs. Delegard was a little off. She did not know what that meant exactly, but she felt sure anyone with that sorrowful face was in need of comforting. She would go and see her and what? Read the Bible to her as the lady of the memoirs had done? Marigold could not see herself doing that, but she would just go to see her, and perhaps the way would be opened up. In the memoirs, a way was always opened up. Marigold slipped up to her room before she went and said a little special prayer, a very earnest, sincere little prayer, in spite of the fact that it was couched largely in the language of the memoirs. Then she stole away through the fragrant evening. Marigold had a moment of panic when she found herself really inside Mrs. Delegard's gate, facing a grim house that looked black against the sunset. But a missionary must be self-reliant. A missionary must not give way to panic. With a gallant smile, Marigold marched down the aisle of daffodils to where Mrs. Delegard was standing among the pale gold of lemon lilies in the shadows, with an amber sky and dark hills behind her, staring unseeingly before her with her large, strange, agate gray eyes. Mrs. Delegard surprised Marigold. Her whole sad face lighted up with a wonderful radiance of joy. She stepped forward and held out her hands. Marigold was to be haunted for weeks by those long, pale hands held out in supplication. "Delight! Delight! You have come back to me," she said. Marigold let Mrs. Delegard take her hands, put her arms around her, press her lips to her forehead. She suddenly felt very queer and frightened. There was something about Mrs. Delegard, and she was being drawn into the house. What was Mrs. Delegard saying in that quick, strange, passionate voice of hers that wasn't like any voice Marigold knew? "I've often seen you walking before me with your face turned away. You'd never wait for me. But now you have come back, Delight. So you must have forgiven me. Have you forgiven me, Delight?" "Oh, yes, yes." Marigold would have said yes to any question. She did not know what she was saying. She was no brave missionary, no ambitious candidate for memoirs. She was only a very badly frightened little girl, shut up in a strange house with a very strange woman. Again, that wonderful flash of joy crossed Mrs. Delegard's face. "Come up to your room, Delight. It is all ready for you. I have kept it all ready. I knew you would come back to me sometime when I had been punished enough. So I have kept it ready for you." Marigold was being drawn up the stairs by that insistent arm, across the hall into a room, a large, shadowy room with 4 great windows, and in the midst a huge white bed with something lying on it. Marigold felt a prickling in the roots of her hair. Was it? "There is your big doll, Delight," said Mrs. Delegard, laughing a little wildly. "I've kept it for you, you see. Take it up and play with it. I want to see you play, Delight. It's so long since I have seen you play. And your dresses are all in the closet for you, see?" She opened the closet door and Marigold saw them, rows of dainty dresses hanging there, awfully like Bluebeard's wives in a picture book she had. Marigold found her voice, a shaky, panicky voice. "Please, may I go home now?" she gasped. I think Mother will be wanting me. It's getting late." A look of alarm crossed Mrs. Delegard's pale face, followed by a look of cunning. "But you are home, Delight. You are my child, though you have left me so long. Oh, it was cruel to leave me so long. But I will not scold you. I will never scold you again. Now you have come back. You must never leave me again, never. I am going to find your father and tell him you have come back. I have never spoken to him since you went away, but I will speak now. Oh, Delight, Delight." Marigold eluded the outstretched arms. "Please, please let me go," she entreated desperately. "I'm not your little Delight. Really, I'm not. My name is Marigold Leslie. Please, dear Mrs. Delegard, let me go home." "You are still angry with me," said Mrs. Delegard sorrowfully. "That is why you talk so. Of course you are Delight. Don't you think I know your golden hair? But you are angry with me because I whipped you that day before you went away. I will never do that again, Delight. You need not be afraid of me, darling. Tell me again that you forgive me, sweetest. Tell me again that you forgive me." "Oh, I do. I do." If only Mrs. Delegard would let her out. But Mrs. Delegard knelt down by her entreatingly. Oh, we will be so happy now that you have come back, Delight. Kiss me, kiss me. You have turned your face away from me so long, my golden-haired Delight. Her voice was so appealing that Marigold, in spite of her terror, could not refuse. She bent forward and kissed Mrs. Delegard, then found herself seized in a wild embrace and smothered with hungry kisses. Marigold tore herself from the encircling arms and darted towards the door, but Mrs. Delegard caught her as she reached it, pushed her aside with a strange little laugh, and slipped out. Marigold heard the key turn in the lock. She was the prisoner in the house of a crazy woman. She knew now. That was what people meant when they called Mrs. Delegard a little off. What could she do? Nothing. Nobody knew where she was, alone in this horrible, big, darkening room with the shrouded windows, with those dreadful dresses of dead Delight hanging in the closet, with that terrible doll lying on the bed like a dead thing, with a huge black bearskin muff on a little stand by the bed. What wild tale had Lazar once told her about those big old-fashioned bearskin muffs? That they were really witches and went out on moonlit nights and danced in the snow. There was a moon tonight. Already its faint radiance was stealing into the room. Suppose the muff began to dance around the room before her. Marigold stifled the scream that rose to her lips. It might bring Mrs. Delegard back. Nothing would be so dreadful as that, not even a bewitched bearskin muff. She was afraid even to move, but she managed to tiptoe to window after window. They were all nailed down, every one of them. Anyway, all of them opened on a steep bare wall, no chance of escape there. And through one, she saw the home light, a cloud of spruce. Had they missed her? Were they searching for her? But they would never think of coming here. She sat down in an old cretonne-covered wing chair by the window, as far as possible from the bed and the muff. She sat there through the whole of the chilly, incredible, everlasting night. Nobody came. At first, there was only a dreadful stillness. There did not seem to be a sound in the whole earth. The wind rose and the moonlight went out and the windows rattled unceasingly, and she was sure the muff moved, and the dresses in the closet surely stirred. Twice she heard footsteps in the hall. Morning came, a cloudy morning with a blood-red sunrise sky. The windows all looked out on green, widespread fields. There was no way in which she could attract attention, no way of escape. She would die here of starvation, and Mother would never know what had become of her. Again and again she heard footsteps passing along the hall. Again and again she held her breath with fear lest they pause at the door. She suffered with thirst as the day wore on, but she felt no hunger. A queer, numb resignation was stealing over her. Perhaps she would die very soon, but that no longer seemed terrible. The only terrible thing was that Mrs. Delegard might come back. Evening again, moonlight again, wind again, a snarling, quarrelsome wind that worried a vine at the window and sent a queer shadow flying across the room to the bearskin muff. It seemed to move. It was moving. Marigold suddenly went to pieces. She shrieked madly. She flew across the room. She tugged frantically at the locked door. It opened so suddenly that she nearly fell over backward. She did not pause to reflect that it could never have been locked at all in spite of the turned key. She was past thinking or reflecting. She fled across the hall, down the stairs, out, into freedom. She never stopped running till she stumbled into the hall at Cloud of Spruce, a hall full of wild, excited people, amid which she caught one glimpse of Mother's white, anguished face before, for the first time in her life, she fainted. "Good God," said Uncle Quan, "here she is." Part 4. It was next day, and Marigold was in bed with Mother sitting by her bedside and Grandmother coming in and out, trying to look disapproving, but too relieved and thankful to make a success of it. The whole story had been told, and much more. Marigold knew all about Mrs. Delegard now. Poor Mrs. Delegard, who had lost her only little child a year ago, and had not been right in her mind ever since. Who had sat for hours by her little girl's side, entreating her to speak to her once more, just one word. Who could not forget for a moment that she had whipped Delight the day before her sudden illness. Who had never forgiven her husband because he had been away when Delight took ill, and there was no one to go for the doctor through the storm. The poor unhappy lady is greatly to be pitied, Mother said. But, oh, darling, what a terrible time you have had. Some of the rest of us have had a terrible time, too, said Grandmother grimly. Mrs. Donkin was sure she saw you at dusk in an automobile with two strange-looking men. And Toff Leclerc's boat is missing, and we thought you had floated out into the channel in it. The whole country has been combed for you, miss. I'm afraid I'm not fit to be a missionary, Mother, sobbed Marigold when Grandmother had gone out. I wasn't brave or resourceful or serene or anything. Mother cuddled her, compassionate, tender, understanding. It's a very fine, splendid thing to be a missionary, dear, and if, when you grow up, you feel called to that particular form of service, nobody will try to hinder you. But the best way to prepare for it is just to learn all you can and get a good education and live as happily and pleasantly as a small girl can meanwhile. Dr. Violet Merriweather was the jolliest little tomboy in the world when we were girls together, a perfect mischief and madcap. Aunt Marigold made her namesake stay in bed for a week. On the day Marigold was allowed to get up, Mother came in smiling. After all, your missionary effort seems to have done some good, Marigold. Mrs. Delegard's doctor says she is very much better. She has ceased to talk about Delight, and she has forgiven her husband. Dr. Ryan says she is quite rational in many ways, and he thinks if she is taken away for a complete change of scene and association, she will recover completely. She says he told him she was forgiven, and this conviction seems to have cured some sick spot in her soul. Humph, said Grandmother, rather gently, however. Isn't it funny she never came back to the room, said Marigold. She probably forgot all about you the minute you were out of her sight. I was so afraid she would. I thought I heard her outside all the time. That was why I never dared go near the door, and it wasn't locked at all, though I know I heard the key turn. I suppose it didn't turn all the way. Keys sometimes stick like that. Wasn't it silly to think I was locked in when I might have got out right away? I guess I've been silly right through, but Marigold sighed. After having been consecrated and set apart for 3 weeks, it was somewhat flat and savorless to come back to ordinary, memoirless life. But visions of a new apricot dress were again flickering alluringly before her eyes, and Sylvia was on the hill, a forgiving Sylvia who made no difference at all because of her brief defection. That ends chapter 15 of Ella Montgomery's Magic for Marigold. I hope you enjoyed it. Thanks very much for listening. This is Andrea signing off.